Well, welcome everyone to this webinar hosted in association with Discover Australia. My name's Sam. I'm an educator who works for the school. I'll be running the behind the scenes this evening, and so you might see me or hear me pop up at various points throughout. But I'm about to hand over to the exceptionally capable Emma Symington MW, who works for Wine Australia and has been hosting a series of webinars for us about the country, about all of the different wines and regions and grape varieties. And this is the last in the current series of webinars. The one thing I should say, there's a couple of things before we kick off. Firstly, this webinar will be recorded and a recording link will be sent to you shortly after the webinar has concluded, probably the next day. And as well, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box, not in the chat, in the Q&A box. And Emma will be answering them throughout the evening. So without further ado, I will hand over to Emma Symington. Emma, take it away.
Thanks, Sam, and hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, afternoon, morning, depending on where you are in the world. So as Sam said, I've done a number of these webinars now for WSET School London. First of all, we did quite a number on various grape varieties in Australia, and more recently, we've done ones looking at different regions. And as you can see, the one this evening is looking at 3 regions within New South Wales, namely the Hunter Valley, Orange, and Canberra District. Now, if I can move my slide on. Before we get into the actual session, just quickly, as Sam said, my name's Emma Symington. You've got my contact details there if you want to find me on social. But I just wanted to point out our education website, which is australianwinediscovered.com, as you can see on the screen there. And if you are studying for your WSET exams, as I'm sure many of you are, this is really a brilliant resource for you to be aware of to learn more about Australian wine. There's loads of modules on there covering all the key grape varieties in Australia, all the major regions, all of our maps are on there, so you can go and download those. There's video content, there's quizzes, all sorts of things are in there. So it really is kind of your one-stop shop for anything you want to learn a bit more about Australian wine. So Australia, many of you will have seen this map before. There's a lot of wine regions in Australia, 65 of them. But today, as I said, we're focusing on the state of New South Wales, which, as you can see, is down in the southeast of the country, and those regions which are kind of an orangey yellow colour. So there's 14 regions within New South Wales, but today, as I said, we're just focusing on 3 of them, which are probably the 3 you most regularly see on wine labels in export markets. Some of the smaller regions within New South Wales, you don't often see quite so regularly in the export markets. And one thing just to point out on a bigger scale, because it is quite important, particularly when we're talking about wine regions in New South Wales, is the Great Dividing Range. So this is that huge range of mountains you can see running down the whole eastern seaboard of Australia. So as you can see, running right from the top of Queensland down through New South Wales and then down through Victoria. Now, this is a really important mountain range for wine regions in Australia because it gives elevation to a lot of them, and particularly through New South Wales, where a lot of the highest peaks in the Great Dividing Range are. And it also acts as a really important rain shadow because particularly towards the end of the summer, through the summer months, you get these tropical storms that kind of barrel down that eastern seaboard of Australia. They hit the Great Dividing Range and dump all their rain. So the vast majority of wine regions in through Queensland and particularly through New South Wales are either on the top or the western side of the Great Dividing Range. So they're in the rain shadow and not affected by all these storms. So just worth pointing that out because I'm going to be talking a bit about elevation and the Great Dividing Range as we talk about these regions. So these are the 3 regions we're going to be focusing on today. As I said, Hunter, which is, as you can see, up north of Sydney, then more west of Sydney into Orange, and then further down into Canberra District. So starting off with the Hunter Valley. Now, Hunter is probably one of Australia's best known wine regions, and also really Australia's most visited wine region. And that's really because of its proximity to Sydney. As you can see, it's an easy 2-hour drive north of Sydney and you're into the Hunter Valley. So you do get a lot of day trippers going there, a lot of people staying over for weekends and so on. It is a really quite a visited wine region. It's also quite famous because it's one of the earliest wine regions in Australia. So it was first planted back in 1823. So it really has a very long history within the Australian wine industry. So just quickly, a little bit of history. As I said, in Hunter, the first vines were planted in 1823. And then some of you who've joined my other webinars may have heard me talk about a man called James Busby before. So he was a Scottish immigrant. He was really important in the Australian wine industry for bringing in numbers of different grape varieties into Australia, bringing them across from France and Spain. And he had a home in Hunter Valley called Kirkton Park, where he planted some of those early vine cuttings. So he is someone that really helped establish Hunter Valley as one of those early wine regions. And as you can see, another famous name in the next point, Dr. Henry Lindeman. So another immigrant, he was a medical doctor, but also planted vineyards. And as it says here, he was really important with sort of promoting the region and bringing everyone together and really pulling it together as a wine region. And then really through the rest of the 1800s and particularly through the 20th century, the region gained in prominence. More and more plantings went in. You can see there's the point here in the early 1900s about Tyrrell's HVD vineyard. That's when that was planted in 1908. And that makes it today one of the oldest Chardonnay vineyards in the world. And Old Vines is actually another important part of the Hunter story that we'll touch on in a little bit later in this session. So today, this is what Hunter Valley looks like today. So many of you may well have seen these maps before, but if you haven't, what this is showing you is, first of all, the boundary of the region, that sort of dark purple line. It's then also showing you official sub-regions within the region, which are these orange sections. And then finally, and perhaps more interestingly, it's showing you exactly where the vineyard sites are in the region. So that's those dark green blobs you can see. So looking at this, firstly, you can tell it's quite a large region in terms of area, but not a hugely planted region in terms of plantings. In fact, there's only about 2,300 hectares within the Hunter Valley, which is pretty small in terms of wine production. And as you can see, looking at this map, the vast majority of those plantings are in a official sub-region called Pecolbin down in the south east of the region. What you can also pick out on this map is some of the topography. So you can see here that Hunter is actually bounded on one side by the ocean and on the other side by the Great Dividing Range. Now, you probably heard me say earlier that most of the wine regions in New South Wales are on the top or the western side of the Great Dividing Range, because then they are in the rain shadow of that range of mountains. Now, Hunter Valley is really unusual because it is actually on the eastern side of the Great Dividing Range. And that means it does get affected by these tropical storms that come down the eastern seaboard. It does have a lot of rainfall through the year, over 750 millimeters, which is pretty high for a wine region. And most of that falls through in the growing season, which isn't often ideal when it comes to viticulture. And if we look in a little bit more detail about the climate in the Hunter Valley, it's interesting because I always think, if you look at the vital stats of Hunter Valley on paper, it's really not where you think you'd be planting vines, frankly, and certainly not where you think you'd be making really high quality premium wine. And I say that because, as it says here, the climate is subtropical. It's one of the warmest wine regions within Australia. It's also one of the wettest and the most humid. And if you know a bit about viticulture, humidity is not great for viticulture because it can result in disease problems. And because of these storms that come through, you can often get rain towards vintage, which again isn't great for viticulture. But it's fascinating because despite this kind of unusual climate in terms of viticulture, you can still make some really quite incredible wines. coming out of Hunter Valley. And that's, I suppose, in part because of the other aspect of being in the rain shadow, or sorry, not in the rain shadow, of the Great Dividing Range. And that's really what you see here, which is cloud. So although it's hot in the Hunter Valley, and in the summer, what I mean by hot is 35, perhaps 40 degrees in the daytime, what you get because you're on the eastern side of the Great Dividing Range, those range of mountains captures any cloud cover and keeps it on the eastern side of those mountains. So typically through the afternoons, certainly through the daytimes in the summer, you typically get pretty thick cloud cover in the Hunter Valley. So although it's hot, you know, you'll be sweating when you're out there, actually the UV, the amount of UV that gets through to the vines, that gets through to the leaves is really decreased by this thick grey cloud. So that means the grapes actually ripen at a much slower rate than you would otherwise expect given these temperatures. So the sugars in the grapes accumulate much slower, but you still get phenolic ripeness. So those flavors are developing in the grapes, but the sugar is developing at a much slower rate than you otherwise might expect. So this is why when you look at something like Semillon, which for Hunter is a totally iconic style of wine, totally unique within the world of wine, no one else in the world makes Semillon quite like Hunter Valley does. So what happens with Semillon and other grape varieties in Hunter Valley is the winemakers can pick quite early because they have that flavor ripeness. So they're picking when the sugar levels are not that high. So this is giving a resulting wine, which is maybe 10.5, 11% in alcohol. So, you know, really pretty low in terms of alcohol, high in terms of acidity, because that acidity hasn't really massively dropped off yet, because those grapes are not fully sugar ripe. But you have this flavor ripeness, this flavor development. So this is what makes Hunter Valley quite special as a wine region and certainly quite unique. And when it comes to soil in the Hunter Valley, it is quite varied, but there's a really nice rule of thumb. As you can see here, looking at these soil samples, on the one hand, on the right hand here, you've got this kind of rich red, kind of clayey, high in nutrient soil. And then you've also got this paler, sandier, white soils. And really, the rule of thumb is that the red grapes go best on those red soils, and the white grapes grow best on those more finely draining, sandier soils. So if I just flip back to this photo, you can see this is that real red, clayey soil. So this, you know, is a red grape vineyard. In fact, this is Shiraz planted here. This is Broken Woods vineyard that they used to make some of their graveyards, Shiraz. So just showing what that looks like in practice. Now, I mentioned earlier about Tyrrell's HVD vineyard, which was planted in 1908, believed to be one of the oldest Chardonnay vineyards in the world. And as I said then, Hunter Valley is really, or old vines, I should say, are really important for Hunter Valley. There's Shiraz still in the ground in Hunter Valley that was planted in the 1860s. I think the oldest Semillon in the Hunter Valley was planted at the very end of the 1800s. So, you know, well over 100 years old. And as I said, the oldest Chardonnay in the world too. So old vines are a really important part of the Hunter Valley story. It's something we talk about a lot when we're talking about somewhere like perhaps Barossa Valley or McLaren Vale over in South Australia. But yeah, don't forget that Hunter Valley also has this amazing repository of old vine vineyards and obviously still being used to make wine to this day. So when it comes to what's planted in Hunter Valley today, these are the top 5 grape varieties, as you can see. I already mentioned Semillon, and that really is the most important grape variety grown in the Hunter Valley. As I said, really made in quite a unique style, very different to Semillon produced elsewhere in the world. And these are stars of wines which are really made for the long haul. These age beautifully over decades because of that high acidity I was talking about, and because of that concentration of flavour that really comes out with time in the bottle. These are quite incredible wines, and certainly some of my favourite wines to drink, if I can keep my hands off them and give them some time in the cellar. So number two, in terms of grape varieties, is Shiraz. Now, again, Hunter Valley Shiraz is quite different to other styles of Shiraz, or what you might expect, I suppose I should say, coming out of Australia. Because of this climate that I've talked about in Hunter Valley, it is always much more medium-bodied in style, much more savoury. So you don't tend to get a lot of ripe fruit flavours in Hunter Valley Shiraz. It's always a much more savoury, kind of earthy style of Shiraz. And very much medium-bodied. And then again, typically kind of 12.5, 13% in alcohol. So really, showing what I was talking about in terms of that cloud cover, limiting the UV and limiting the ripening that is going on in the grapes. So it's always a nice one to show people if you want to surprise someone with an Australian Shiraz that is not what they're expecting. Certainly made much more in the kind of Syrah style. And then, as you can see, Chardonnay, Verdelho, Tempranillo. So interesting to get a few alternative grape varieties coming here in this top 5. Tempranillo is a really interesting one generally within Australia because it's one of those alternative grape varieties that's really on the cusp of becoming mainstream because it's being planted in more and more regions. More and more people are interested in it as a grape variety, and it seems to be very well suited to a number of wine regions in Australia. Okay, did anyone have any questions on the Hunter Valley before we move on? Okay, since the sun is buffered by the clouds and sugar accumulation is therefore reduced, why do we still have phenolic ripeness and aroma flavour development at Hunter Valley? Good question. It's because phenolics develops in a different way to sugars. So sugars is absolutely dependent on the vine growing and producing sugars through the leaves and so on. Phenolics is happening in a different way, and it's not so dependent on the amount of UV. I don't personally know all the chemical, chemistry behind that, but that is what we see in the Hunter Valley. So I suppose it's the outcome of it rather than necessarily knowing what's causing it. And I'm not sure if anyone does know what's causing it, but this is just what happens in the Hunter Valley. Right, any other questions? Otherwise, we'll move on. If anything comes through, oh, quickly, great. Has there been any experiments with making Madeira-style wines since they already plant Verdelho? Admittedly, Hunter summer temperatures are markedly higher than Madeira. They are indeed. Good question. Off the top of my head, I can't think of anyone making Madeira-style wines. That's not to say they're not, but my guess is unlikely given the market for fortified wines these days. My guess, and knowing that you get a lot of Verdelho made as single varietal table wine, I don't believe anyone is making it as Madeira style, but there's always an exception to the rule. Okay, let's move on. So, okay, quickly one from Mark. Any dessert wines due to high humidity? Good question. Again, I can't think of any off the top of my head, and I suspect that's because you probably wouldn't want to leave any grapes too long on the vine because, as I said, you often get these storms coming particularly towards the end of summer, and rain towards vintage is just not great. So I don't think so. And there are regions certainly which are making dessert wines with high humidity. In Riverina, which is more further inland, has a lot of small rivers going through it, and high humidity through the autumn because of that, causing botrytis. So this is where De Bortoli Noble 1 comes from. It's not something I've come across in Hunter. So for our second region, we're moving to this small region called Orange. So as you can see, we're headed west of Sydney here. It's about 200 kilometres west of Sydney, a 4-hour drive, which it doesn't look very far on the map there, but there's a lot of small winding roads. You've got to go up through the Blue Mountains. It's a really beautiful journey if you get the chance to do it, up to Orange. Now, Orange is a region. It did have some early vineyards back in the 1800s, but the first commercially planted vineyards weren't until the 1980s. So it's a really modern wine region. Prior to that, and really still now, it's been a very important orchard region within Australia. Lots of fruits like cherries, apples, pears, and so on are grown there. And as we know from other regions around the world, other wine regions around the world, places that grow things like apples very well tend to be very well suited to viticulture. And really, that's what we've seen in Orange, although it's got this very short timeline or history in terms of viticulture, 40 years really. Quite a lot has happened in that time, and it is quite an exciting wine region. So looking at our topographical map, you can see again, not a huge amount of plantings today, though that probably shouldn't be a surprise given, how new it is as a wine region. There's just over 1,000 hectares in Orange. And the really important thing about Orange is that it is actually defined by elevation. So the border, you can see, the border of the region is actually the 600-meter contour line. So any vineyard within Orange has to be above 600 meters to be part of the region. It's a region that is actually based around the slopes of an extinct volcano called Mount Canobolas. So it's that contour line of that volcano which forms the region. So altitude, of course, is such an important part of Orange as a wine region. As I said, that 600-meter contour line is sort of the regional boundary, and then if everything goes up from there. But as you can see here, the highest vineyards are well over 1,000 meters. So this is the highest wine region within Australia, growing at really quite significant altitude. So in terms of its climate, it absolutely is a continental climate. It's inland, there's no influence from the ocean, but that cooling influence of elevation is really important. So that high elevation means you're getting lovely, warm, sunny days in the summer, but a big diurnal variation. So warm and sunny on a summertime day, but dropping really swiftly at nighttime. And I remember I went there on a wine trip a number of years ago, and I was with a group of people from, I think they were all from the UK. And we arrived sort of mid-afternoon. It was in late summer, and it was a beautiful sunny day, and we were all there in our t-shirts and shorts, we were tasting wine with the winemakers. And the sun was setting, and we realised that people were starting putting on jumpers and, getting scarves out their backs. And we kind of all thought, this is crazy. It's summer. What are you doing? And I can't tell you how quickly the temperature changed as soon as that sun set. It really dropped significantly. We were all kind of digging in our bags trying to find anything warm we could possibly put on. But it really emphasized to me just how significant this diurnal variation they have in oranges because of this influence of altitude. And then the other important influence of altitude that you see in Orange and other high elevation regions is high UV levels. Now, as I said earlier, we're up in the Great Dividing Range, and here we're very much on the western side of the Great Dividing Range, so we're in the rain shadow. And that means you typically get very clear, cloudless skies throughout the summer. It's one of Australia's sunniest cool climate wine regions. And because of all of this, you get very high UV levels. And I think just looking at this photo gives you an idea of just how high the UV gets in Orange. So although it's a cool climate region, as I said, with that big diurnal variation, you do get high UV levels, which helps to promote phenolic ripeness and helps to promote tannin ripeness as well. So although, it's a relatively cool climate region and you're going to keep lots of acidity and freshness and elegance in the wines, you can get this flavor ripeness, and particularly when it comes to reds, those tannins get lovely and softened. There are a lot of tannins, but they're really much softer than perhaps those produced at lower elevation levels, which means you get lovely concentrated wines but with lovely soft tannins. Now, the soils in Orange, as I said, Orange is based on an extinct volcano called Mount Canobolas. So unsurprisingly, the vast majority of soils within Orange are based on volcanic and tend to be pretty high in fertility. As you can see, if you want to read this slide, there's 4 kind of main soil types within orange. There is this, it's not one just soil type. There is this difference across the region. And as you get down to some of those lower elevation levels, you are having a bit of limestone coming through as well. So it's not all volcanic. There is something else happening too. But just to give you an overview of what's happening in orange. And then again, turning to the top 5 varieties in the region. Now, Shiraz is number 1 here, which you might be surprised at when you consider it's a cool climate region. But as I said, because of that high UV, you still get this lovely ripeness of flavour, and you get this particularly kind of softening of the tannins. And as we know in Australia, Shiraz is the most planted grape variety across Australia, 1/4 of all plantings. And with orange being a pretty modern wine region, it's sort of not surprising that that is one of the grape varieties people started planting. It will be interesting to see in time if this kind of shifts and different varieties come to prominence as the winemakers and the viticulturists really begin to get much more understanding of the region and what varieties work well in different parts of the region. And also remembering, as I said, there is this variation in elevation across orange. So typically things like Shiraz, Cabernet, Merlot are going to be grown at those lower elevations, sort of 600-meter vineyards, whereas things like Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc, and other varieties not mentioned on here, like Pinot Gris, Riesling, and so on, tend to be grown at the higher elevation sites, where you're going to get much more freshness and acidity and elegance. So it's an interesting region because you do have this ability to grow different grape varieties based on those different climates because of that influence of elevation. So as you can see on this slide, so this is from average crush data from 2017 to 2021. And before this session, I went in and looked at the recent crush data from 2023, so last vintage. And actually this had changed quite significantly. Cabernet had fallen off entirely, and Pinot Gris had come into 3rd position. And I think even Pinot Noir might have knocked Merlot off 5th spot. So that just, again, gives you some indication about how things are changing in orange. Different grape varieties are becoming more important as the winemakers and growers sort of realize what they're doing in the region and what grape varieties are best suited to any particular site, and of course taking into account what their consumers, what their customers are looking for. Okay, there's a question come through. What's a good climatic equivalent for orange during the growing season? Okanagan? Possibly. I'm not sure it's quite got the altitude. Somewhere in Argentina, more likely. So that is that influence of altitude that's really the most important part of orange. As I said, giving that diurnal variation, which is huge, and also that influence of UV. And this influence of UV is going to be the same in high altitude regions elsewhere around the world. So this is why Argentinian Malbec is so different to a lot of French Malbec. You tend to get that much more rounder, softer tannin because of this influence of UV. So I'm not sure I can think really of a good climatic equivalent off the top of my head. There must be some, and probably somewhere up in the Andes is where you're going to be looking, to be honest. Due to the volcanic soils, have the wines a different aroma flavor profile? To what would be my question to that. Good question. I wouldn't say personally I get a huge amount of sort of saline minerality coming off wines from orange. But again, as I said, this is such a young wine region. A lot of the vineyards are going to have pretty young vines. So, this influence of terroir and so on is going to take time to come through in a region. I would say it's a region that's really worth keeping your eyes on and keeping your eyes out for. We don't see a lot of these wines in the export markets, but there really are some very exciting wines being produced there. And, it's certainly one to keep in mind. With the high UV, does Riesling and orange have particularly high TDN levels, or do they make effort to shield the grapes with leaves? Absolutely the latter there. Yes, shading will be really important. In Australia, generally any winemaker you talk to would refer to TDN as being a fault. It's not something Australian winemakers want to see in their Riesling. So, you know, working the vineyard properly, canopy management in the correct way to have that shading of the grapes is really important, and absolutely that will be front of mind. What percentage of wines from Hunter and Orange are exported? Do the Australians keep them for themselves? I don't know on the regions. I'm sorry, I could have looked that up. I didn't. If you want to get any of the export data, or you know, the crush data that I've been talking about, it's all available to anyone via the Wine Australia website. There's a huge amount of information in there. You have to go into, I think it's the Market Insights tab, and then it's in Interactive Insights. There's export data back to 2010, I think it is, and the crush data goes back to 2015, something like that. A huge amount of information. It's fascinating. I get sucked down that rabbit hole quite often. My guess, though, in terms of how much is exported, probably not a huge amount of either, and that's because really both of them are so close to Sydney, so there's such a strong domestic market for both of these wines, or both these regions I should say, that I suspect it's probably not as high as the total for Australia. So the total for Australia in terms of export is about 60% of everything produced is exported. My guess is for these two regions it will be somewhat less than that. Okay, right, let's move on to our third region, which is Canberra District. So here, as you can see, we are now southwest of Sydney. Again, as you can hopefully pick out from this map, still up in the Great Dividing Range. And we're not only in New South Wales, but also spanning the Australian Capital Territory, which is the specific territory encompassing the city of Canberra. Now, vines in Canberra were planted in the 1800s, a bit like in Orange, but really commercial viticulture, again, didn't happen until much more recently. The first vines were really planted in 1971. That was a winery you may well have heard of called Clonakilla. And looking at this map again, you can see today it's pretty tiny. There's only about, I think, 250 hectares in Canberra District. Really, really small in terms of production. But that being said, it's a region that has kind of changed many people's perception, particularly of Australian Shiraz. And that's because of the winery I just mentioned called Clonakilla. Back in 1992, I think it was, maybe 1993, they released their first Shiraz Viognier. And it very quickly became a cult wine because it was something that was so totally different to what people expected or knew from Australian Shiraz, because of this high altitude impact, you know, much more restrained and elegant in style. And it's something that's really put Canberra as a wine region on the map, and made a lot of people sort of sit up and take notice of it. That being said, you can see there's today still very little in terms of vineyard area. Now, looking at this map, you can also see where New South Wales is and where the Australian Capital Territory is towards the southwest. And as you can see, there's only actually one vineyard that is all one vineyard within the Australian Capital Territory. That's from a winery called Mount Bajura. Everything else sits within New South Wales. So again, the story here is about the influence of elevation. Now, we're not quite as high as in Orange. So here we're sitting at between about 500, 550 meters up to about 900 meters in terms of elevation. So not as high as Orange, but still, you know, a significant amount of elevation. So warm climate here, extremely continental again. It can get a bit hotter here than in Orange during the daytime in the summer, you know, 30 degrees, perhaps a little bit more. But again, you're going to have that big diurnal variation, dropping significantly at nighttime, much cooler nights, and cool autumns and cold winters. And both Canberra and to a even greater extent in Orange, these are regions where frost is a problem. Frost is a real viticultural hazard, and you get a lot of snow as well in the winter, which again is something that a lot of people don't necessarily expect when it comes to Australia. And again, with Canberra, as I was saying, in orange, because of this influence of elevation. I know this photo's got some cloud, but typically you have, long, clear summer days with high UV, which again, gives you that lovely ripeness of the tannins when I'm talking about the red grapes. And this again is really what made people sort of sit up and take notice of the Clonakilla Shiraz Viognier when it was released, because that texture that this high UV gives to those Shiraz grapes is something that people were just not expecting from Australia. And it really was quite different and caused quite the storm when it was first released. So just a quick overview of Canberra as a region. As I said, continental climate, pretty young. There's a lot of potential there for the future, lots more places that could be planted. So again, a region to keep an eye on. And in terms of plantings, it's really based on two key grape varieties. Shiraz, as I mentioned, almost 40% of plantings are Shiraz, so really important to the region. And then number two would be Riesling, and that's about 25% of all plantings. And if you haven't tried a Canberra District Riesling, I'd really suggest, if you get the chance, do, because it's a style that is very different to Eden Valley or Clare Valley, the more classic styles of Australian Riesling. Typically, Canberra Riesling is a little bit softer in terms of acidity. There's a lot of acidity, but it's not so hard as in Clare and Eden, and much more floral and kind of open in terms of style. Really, really pretty styles of Riesling, typically made bone dry, but a few people are experimenting with varying levels of residual sugar as well. Okay, that was my overview on Canberra. Did anyone have any more questions really on any of those three regions? I think they're all three, really interesting regions within New South Wales. As I said, overall, none of them have got a huge amount of plantings, but all producing some really delicious wines, and particularly with the latter two, Orange and Canberra District. If you haven't tried any of those wines, I would really urge you to go out and seek them, because there's some really delicious wines made in both of those regions. Okay, question. How significant are cellar door and other direct sales in these regions near the major economic centres of Sydney, but also Canberra? Are wine clubs a significant path to market? Yes, for sure. And yes, they will be significant. Yeah, I mean, these regions which are near these major sort of population centres in Australia. So here, obviously, Canberra District, we've got Canberra. Orange and Sydney are both pretty close to Sydney. Sorry, Orange and Hunter are both pretty close to Sydney. Yeah, definitely domestic sales, really important. They're all regions where, well, particularly Hunter Valley and Orange, where wine tourism is really important. These are regions where, people go not only to go and taste wine, but the wineries often have amazing restaurants. There's often golf courses and so on around and about. So yeah, domestic demand is very important. And I would say that similarly, say in Yarra Valley and Mornington Peninsula outside Melbourne. So, different parts of Australia, absolutely different regions have very similar concepts. Teresa, what other grapes grown in Canberra beside Riesling and Shiraz? A whole host, actually, all sorts of different things. A number of the alternative grape varieties. So it's actually the first region in Australia where Gruner Veltliner was planted. Today, the Adelaide Hills are much better known for Gruner Veltliner because there's quite a few producers of them. But the first one was at Lark Hill in Canberra District. And there's a number of those other alternative varieties planted there. There's also more of the classic Chardonnay and so on, all produced in relatively smaller quantities. There's a bit of Pinot Noir up there as well. So yeah, a number of different grape varieties. Catherine, can I comment more about Clonakilla? Yeah, so Clonakilla, as I said, was the first winery or first vineyard planted in Canberra. That was back in 1971. So it was planted by Dr. John Kirk. So he was from Ireland originally, hence the name Clonakilla. It came, I think it was the name of his grandfather's farm in County Clare in Ireland. He was a researcher based at CSIRO in Canberra. CSIRO is one of the big scientific research organisations in Australia. And he always really liked wine, liked drinking wine. And when he moved to Canberra, was sort of surprised that no one else was, that there was no vineyards there. He sort of thought it would be a great place to start planting vineyards. So that's what he did. It wasn't his sort of main job, but he kind of did it on the side. Then latterly, his son, Tim Kirk, has become the winemaker. He's the one that travelled across to Côte Rôtie, saw that people were co-fermenting Shiraz and Viognier, tried some of the Lala wines from Guigal, got really excited about them, went back home to his father's vineyard. His father handily had planted a bit of Viognier as well as Shiraz. And that vintage, the Viognier, was going to be the first crop. And he managed to convince his father that rather than creating a varietal Viognier, they should use it to create their first co-fermented Shiraz Viognier. And that's what they did, and released it to market the following year or two. And since then, Clonakilla Shiraz Viognier really is one of the top kind of cult wines within Australia. Really incredible wines. If you can get your hands on them, they're quite expensive these days, sadly, but really made in just that lovely kind of elegant, refined style. Very much kind of Northern Rhone, I suppose, if you like, in terms of structure. And in terms of body and weight, and just this lovely floral lift. That's really amazing. Right, next question. These three regions are located at, no, not low altitude, high altitude for the second two, low altitude for Hunter Valley, high altitude for Orange and Canberra District. Will climate warming be a threat? Good question. I reckon climate warming is a threat to wine regions around the world. I would say it's a threat to all of us. Of course, it is happening, well, regions are seeing it happening at a greater or lesser extent in different places. Now, in the Hunter Valley, interestingly, although it has this, hot subtropical climate, quite humid, actually at the minute, it's one of the regions that is not showing any great changes over time. So we'll see what happens there. I would say Orange and Canberra, because they're at such high altitude, you have that cooling influence of elevation. So yes, of course, the world is warming, things will change over time. But I think because of this high elevation, they will have the opportunity to plant other grape varieties in the future that they can't plant now because they can't ripen them. So yes, of course, things will change in 50, 100 years' time, as they will in regions around the world. But I suspect because of this influence of elevation, particularly that Orange and Canberra have, there is possibility for the future. Absolutely. Teodoro, is the rotundone compound generally better preserved in the grapes coming from the cooler climates of Orange and Canberra compared to other warmer regions? That is a really interesting question. So for any of you who don't know, rotundone is the chemical compound that is created in grapes, giving that black pepper flavour. And that's something you typically get in Shiraz or Syrah that is produced in cool climate wine regions. Now, you do get rotundone, you get high levels of rotundone in some cool climate wine regions in Australia, places like Yarra Valley, the Grampians, other parts of Victoria particularly, but there is a number of them. Interestingly, even though Orange and Canberra are cool climates, typically you don't tend to get high levels of rotundone. And this is what the winemakers will tell you as well. And I don't know why. I don't know why you don't get these high levels of rotundone in these regions. It may be something to do with the UV. I don't know. I mean, rotundone as a compound in wine was only discovered back in 2007. It was some research done, in fact, by the Australian Wine Research Institute. So there hasn't been, decades and decades of research done onto this chemical compound. Perhaps in the future, we will understand a bit more about when it is produced and at what levels and so on. But right now, I don't think we know why these regions typically don't get such high levels of rotundone. Ricky, any specific reasonably priced wines that you'd recommend to try that showcases these three regions? So, well, starting with Hunter, I mean, get your hands on a Hunter Semillon. Frankly, you can't go wrong. Hunter Semillon is just beautiful. I find some Tyrrells, some Broken Woods, even, some of your basic McGuigan Hunter Semillons, particularly with some age, are delicious. There's a lot of different wineries, but I really don't think you'll go far wrong. Orange, yes, absolutely. There's some great wineries. Logan is one of my favorites. Oh gosh, you're going to put me on the spot now off the top of my head. Cumulus is another one. I'm trying to think of ones that are going to be relatively widely available. Trying to think of, and Weimala, which is another label that Logan Winery produces. Oh, and Philip Shaw makes some lovely wines from Orange. Canberra Clonakilla, as I've said, they do make a number of different wines. Obviously, their Shiraz Viognier is at the top and fairly expensive, amazing, but definitely a special occasion wine. But they also produce, much more reasonable in terms of pricing. The Rieslings I love out of Canberra District from a winery called Helm. Now, unfortunately, they're really not widely available. I see them very occasionally in the UK, but that's something you probably need to be in Australia for. But Eden Road, based in Canberra District, really worth seeking out. Oh, I don't think I think of anyone else off the top of my head. But I would say particularly both for Orange, well, in fact, for all three of these regions, typically they're regions which are dominated by smaller family-owned wineries. Now, Hunter does have some bigger stuff as well, but particularly Orange and Canberra, I think you probably can't go far wrong. And, when it comes to exports, so little we see over here. So if you can get your hands on one, do. Any other questions? You've highlighted how few hectares are planted, especially in the newer regions of Orange and Canberra. In Europe, it's difficult to get permission to plant new vineyards. Are there similar limitations in Australia, or is expanding plantings fairly straightforward? Can we expect significant increases in vineyard area in these high altitude regions? Well, firstly, no, there's no limitations. Viticulturalists, wine growers are able to plant really whatever they want, wherever they want. So there's no limitations like there is in Europe. That being said, of course, from a financial point of view, they have to be, have to know that they're going to be able to sell those wines at the end of the day. As I said, in Australia, most production in Australia is exported. 60, sometimes 70%, depending on the vintage, is exported to markets around the world. You have to remember Australia is a huge country, bigger than Europe, but there's only 25 million people living in Australia. So domestic demand is always going to be relatively small. So, yes, you can plant more vineyards, but you need to make sure you're going to be able to sell them. So I don't think we're going to see any huge increases in terms of plantings anywhere. As we all know, globally, demand for wine is in decline. So, the idea of planting huge amounts of new vineyards probably isn't the most sensible decision economically. That being said, I think we'll probably will see a bit more vineyard area in these regions over time, because they are quite exciting and because of that high altitude and cooler climate styles, which is something that a lot of people are seeking. Teodoro, what are your opinion the most important factors that make Hunter Valley Semillon age so well, developing a great complexity in the bottle? Well, firstly, the acidity. Hunter Valley acidity is always very high in Semillon, so that absolutely keeps the wine pristine in bottle and allows it to age for so long. And then because Hunter Valley Semillon, as I said, it's picked relatively early, so they have this kind of flavour concentration, but it needs time in bottle to really begin to unfurl and unwind and develop. It's fascinating because often Hunter Valley Semillon, when it's very, very young, is sort of lemony and limey and high in acidity, but there's not a lot of flavor concentration or interest. And it's only in time that those flavors begin to, develop. And you get these lovely layers of flavors, you get more texture, you get more weight. And it just is what happens with Hunter Valley Semillon in bottle. It's fascinating. And over time, you tend to also get these kind of toasty, buttered toast kind of flavors coming through, which if you didn't know better, you might think is because of some oak aging, but absolutely not. Hunter Valley Semillon is always in stainless steel, unoaked, but it's just this development in bottle that occurs over time and gives you these beautiful layers of complexity. Any further questions? I should say as well, whilst we're talking about Hunter Valley Semillon, I did do a little while ago a session specifically looking at Semillon. I think it was and Sauvignon Blanc in Australia. So if you want to learn a bit more, do go and have a look at that session, because we did dive into this in a bit more detail. Costas, I always thought of Tyrrell's VAT1 as the benchmark for Hunter Semillon. Yep, me too. Even though it needs 15 plus years to really show its character. What sets it apart from all other wines? Well, I would agree with you, but there's certainly other Hunter Valley Semillon at that level. I mean, Brokenwood ILR, absolutely. But equally, I would say all Hunter Valley Semillon kind of needs that amount of time in bottle, or benefits from that amount of time in bottle. You know, if you talk to Bruce Tyrrell, he often refers to the 3 ages of Hunter Valley Semillon, sort of up to 5 years old, when, as I said, they're kind of lemony and limey and not a huge amount going on. And then kind of from 5 to about 15 years, you're beginning to get this lovely opening and layers of complexity developing, slight softening of acidity. And then that 15 years plus is when you're getting even more layers of complexity, this kind of toasty character developing. Again, a slight softening of acidity and broadening of weight. You get this much more kind of creamy, almost texture. So yes, it does need time to show its character, but that's also kind of the joy of Hunter Valley Semillon. Just the way it evolves in bottle. And at least, VAT1 is not released till at least 5 years after vintage. So you already have some of that bottle aging done for you. And then, the ideal would be buy a case and drink a bottle over, a number of years to see how it evolves, if you have the money to be able to do that, of course. But, I've bought much more reasonably priced Hunter Valley Semillons and just stuck them into my wine rack and come back to them 5, 10, 15 years later. And it's really worth doing, because even some of the basic Hunter Valley Semillon with that amount of time in bottle just evolves into something so special and so delicious. You don't always need to be buying that one. I'm loving all this interest in Hunter Valley Semillon now. It's great. It's one of my favourite styles of wine. I'll just see if there's any other questions coming through. Just while we wait, I'll just move on just to put this little reminder up again about our education programme. There is a lot of information on there if you want to learn any more about Hunter Valley or Semillon or anything else, indeed.
I think that looks like all of the questions, Emma. Thank you so much for a fascinating session and completing the entirety of Australia. We really appreciate it. And thank you all for joining as well. As a reminder, we will be uploading this webinar to our YouTube channel, and you will receive a link when it has been uploaded. Emma, I think that's a good point to maybe say goodbye.
All right. Thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoyed that.
Thank you. Have a lovely evening, everyone, and we'll see you at another webinar soon.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.